incarnation is an ongoing process, like of cosmogenesis and Christogenesis. And we are part of that process. And so I'm going to probably try to pepper him through until we get to hit the main slides on him. And I'm probably going to, in terms of time, I might have to skip a few of the beginning slides just so we can focus on him. But let's try. Let's see what we got. So you guys know this passage from Isaiah 45, chapter 40, verse 5. Then the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. I don't remember where, that has been a reading of ours in the last couple of weeks, but it came to me this week as a really appropriate theme for this set of talks, because, so one of the translations is, and all humankind shall see it together. But the Hebrew is really closer to this idea of the flesh shall see it together. And so, one of the things about Chardin and his ideas of the incarnation is that matter and spirit are just two sides of the same coin. Okay? Spirit only comes to us through matter. Okay? And that means not just matter in the sense of like wood and stone and stuff, but also words and thoughts. Okay, so they are things that come through our senses into our brains and create ideas and things like that. So the idea that the glory of the Lord, which is in some sense invisible, right? God is invisible. The glory of the Lord is in some sense invisible. But the only way we can perceive the glory of the Lord is if it comes through our senses. So he does not necessarily like make this distinction between the body and the mind, okay? They're two aspects of the same energy, what he calls, and he will end up in his life calling energy, but the same stuff. Okay? So this is Isaiah, remember? So this sort of incarnational idea is back even in the Hebrew Bible, that the glory of the Lord is revealed in the world. Okay, so just do some fun with poetry, because we all like poetry. So who wants to, somebody volunteer to read if they can see that? Anybody? Anybody? Go ahead, Angela.
Make no mistake, if he rose at all, it was as his body. If the cell's dissolution did not reverse, the molecule reknit, the amino acids rekindle, the church will fall. It was not as the flowers, each soft spring recurrent. It was not as his spirit in the mouths and befuddled eyes of the 11 apostles. It was his flesh, ours. The same hinged thumbs and toes, the same valved heart that pierced, died, withered, paused, and then regathered, out of enduring might, new strength to enclose.
Remember that picture from the resurrection at the, I always forget the name, but I think it's Cockham Churchyard. But I'll show you a detail of it later, but if you can see people kind of rising up out of the graves in their clothes that they worked in, a lot of them are their working clothes. So, and then, you want to keep going? Same, we're not, that was only 3 stanzas, so there's 7 total, so.
Let us not mock God with metaphor, analogy, sidestepping, transcendence, making of the event a parable, a sign painted in the faded credulity of earlier ages. Let us walk through yore. The stone is rolled back, not paper mache, not a stone in a story, but the vast rock of materiality that in the slow grinding of time will eclipse for each of us the wide light of day. And if we have an angel at a tomb, make it a real angel, weighty with Max Planck's quanta, vivid with hair opaque in the dawn light, robed in real linen, spun on a different loom.
A definite loom, yeah, spun on a definite loom. That's a detail. That dude naked, he's like, oh, okay. Last stanza.
Let us not seek to make it less monstrous. For our own convenience, our own senses,
Okay, what do y'all think? I'll go to the beginning if you want to see that. Just give me some general thoughts. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this poem.
The beginning's depressing.
Why?
I guess, I don't know, it makes me feel, the church will fall, like.
If you don't really think that his body and all its flesh actually rose again and the molecules reknit, then the church will fall. So, Ruth Ann, were you going to say something?
Well, if we don't take it all in as reality.
Sort of literally.
Literally.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like if we use any metaphor, you're being windy, or something like that. Larry, yeah.
So, how do we discern the difference between ego and spirit if our thoughts are the vehicle, or one vehicle through which it's manifest? That seems to me to be kind of key.
So are you to say that in reference to this, or in reference to what I said before about matter and spirit being two sides of the same coin? Were you saying, what were you said, because I think if I heard what you said how do we figure out whether the thoughts that are coming to us are actually of God or just of our ego kind of thing, like of our self just talking to ourselves, right? So that's a good question. I mean, I think it is this question that Adam will later talk about in terms of discernment in his sermon today, but I won't steal anything. But this idea of how do you discern the spirits, and I do think it's a great question. Maybe we could come back to it a little bit more, but I think community is one answer to that question. We tend to get very egotistical when we don't have others to bounce off us. Desjardins will say, the world will teach you. It's not, even though he's a very optimistic guy about evolution and all that, he recognizes that in the course of in the course of natural events, there will be disasters. There will be setbacks, there will be death, there will be grief. And so, in some ways, that's how he might answer that question, I would think. I don't know, that your very life will teach you about egoism. But also I think it's others, other humans will teach you too, not just random events of life. So let me I'm going to move on from this. I think this poem is pretty cool only because it's a little shocking, right? Like really, John Updike is not exactly a 14th century, traditionalist as far as I know, but he's obviously wants the resurrection and therefore the incarnation to be about the real, about us. Marilyn.
Read those in a second.
Sure.
Is that the very beginning?
No, this is the first.
Yeah,
The-
next.
The last line. The last one is this one. You mean the one prior?
Right,
These are the first four stanzas,
okay.
or first three stanzas.
Well, somewhere in there it said that we each go down our own path, and you don't take this literally, that it's,
You're talking about maybe if we have an angel at the tomb, that part? No, it's good that you heard that in there, but to be honest, I think he sort of says the opposite. You've got to believe, in this poem, he's somehow telling us, do take it literally. But you know what? It's interesting, Marilyn, and I think if we had more time to really delve into this, I do wonder if there's irony in this poem.
yeah,
I
from the Southern Baptist group.
yeah,
I've got a lot of,
Yeah.
you have to believe it
Yes.
literally, and I'm
Yeah.
thinking, but the Bible has lived for so long
Yeah.
because we don't.
Right.
take it
Exactly. And earliest church scholars of the scriptures said you don't have to take it all literally, we have to. So I have a John Updike, by the way, is Episcopalian, so there's no way. I just can't believe that. I think there's irony in this. First of all, weighty with Max Planck's quanta don't really weigh much of anything, you know? So like, and an angel having a material body, well, that's not really what we even think. The angels are immaterial. So I do think there's, like I said, this was just more meant to sort of, again, get us back into that idea of the flesh being like important. But I think John Updike's being I think he's being a little tongue-in-cheek, to be honest. But I don't know. So we'll move on from this one, because we got plenty to do. So this dude is named Maximus the Confessor. So, yes, very important figure that all should know. You all know him, I'm sure. Yeah, he was some people would say that he was a bridge between East and West. He came after the Council of Chalcedon, when the whole thing about the hypostatic union that you guys are all now experts in. I will give Connie and Brian and Adam. Okay, I know you aren't here, but everybody else in here knows exactly about the hypostatic union and what that means. But Maximus was writing after the Council of Chalcedon, and he kind of almost took that for granted in some of his writings. So let's read a little bit of what he has to say. So he says, our Creator guides the irrational love which we have directed toward present divergence back to that which is beloved by nature. I wonder if the Greek really sounded like that. I have a feeling that the people who read the Greek didn't really, I don't know that they said this thing about present divergence, but whatever, this is the translation we have. So basically, irrational love is eros in the Greek. And God, in this case, he's talking about the Creator God sort of directing our loves. You know, like that old song, I look for love in all the wrong places, or look, you're looking for love in all the wrong places. That's kind of this sort of sentiment. And the reason I'm bringing this back up is because I want you to remember back, if you can, and if you don't remember back, I can remind you of that tension between the passions and the body and matter and the spirit. Remember, for these early guys, a lot of times the spirit was in opposition to matter. To get more spiritual, you had to get less mattery, if there's a word like that. And then this whole idea of God heals. Remember the Incarnation was a healing thing. Heals our self-directed passions away from evil, just as he set the chaos of matter in good order according to the better plan that God knows. So what I think is kind of interesting here is that he is, first of all, like reintroducing this idea of the creation as ongoing. Okay, this is Maximus the Confessor. This is not Pierre de Chardin. This is some dude from way back. And he's already talking a little bit about this ongoing idea of creation, that matter in itself does have a little chaos in it, and that God is trying to create that chaos within us, draw us toward this better plan, We bear this chaos in our own bodies. And this is kind of cool. This is actually a quote from him. He says, be good to each other, because we all have a little chaos in us. And maybe your order can order somebody else.
Rick, so is he saying that he brought good order, though, from being born or from dying?
No, he's saying, you're talking about the Incarnation versus the crucifixion?
Right, like how did Jesus bring good order?
I'll show you. Yeah, we'll show you. We'll see. We'll see if we can kind of get that idea. What is it that actually draws us towards it? It's all of it, to be honest. It's the birth, death, and resurrection, and ascension too. Okay, remember all this? I did this so that you guys would all remember. He had ineffably the supreme goodness of the will towards his creatures, and this will was for him to mingle without change, remember, without change, with the nature of humanity through the true hypostatic union. So don't worry, again, about trying to figure out what hypostatic union means. Just remember this whole idea, that early idea of the Incarnation was that the two natures came together in Jesus, did not mix into one nature, but were still united in this thing called a hypostasis, which, to be honest, I don't think they really understood what the heck they were talking about. I mean, and that's not just me. Some scholars will say, hypostasis, what is hypostasis? It's a kind of, what they did, though, was they kind of established that, look, the divine and the human are not mixed into this new super thing. They're both there, and the human in some way is being redirected by the divine. is being reordered. I was thinking of a metaphor, and I was thinking about magnets. And I was thinking about how an MRI works. So an MRI magnetizes, and all the water molecules line up in a certain direction toward the poles of the magnet, because water has a plus and a negative, And then when you turn off the MRI, the water kind of goes back. And somehow that emanates energy, and they can create an image out of it. Don't ask me that part. But the idea of that magnet kind of reorienting. So that's a metaphor for some of the way I think they were thinking. But look at this. So that he might become human, and by the union with him he would deify, meaning make God like humanity. Also, he divided wisely the ages, and he appointed a part of them to work for him, becoming a man, meaning all of the time from creation up to Jesus was one age, and then he becomes a man, and all after Jesus, it's the deification age. We live in the age of deification, according to Maximus. So, it's, he does speculate, what's it like to be really at the goal? Will we finally make it to the omega point, as Teilhard would say? It's like this sabbatical rest. We all rest in God and contemplate God. But it's very joyful. He thinks it's joyful. So anyway, what I want to get us thinking about here with this guy is, here is this sense of, yes, he focuses on humanity, but it's really all of creation kind of moving in this direction of God. Like, that the creation has this chaos, and this chaos needs to be ordered. And the whole process of the history of the universe is this reordering. And we humans, our task is to reorder too, with God's grace, through the community. Okay, listen, again, this is mostly just to see this idea of the economy of the universe, like that the order of the universe. So there's, like, everything has, according to Maximus, has this sort of uniqueness to it, this unique sort of principle, if you will, called a logos. You remember logos. Logos is the word. Remember, the word became flesh. That Greek word is logos. But it was also understood to be a principle. Like, there's this rickness. Okay, rickness. I have a rickness. And that rickness was with God in the beginning. And that rickness was what God used to create me. And that rickness is also in the big logos, Christ. And so Christ calls me not just to be Jesus, who had his own logos, but to be Rick in my own way. And that is how God wanted in the end. And so all of us are being called into our uniqueness, according to Maximus. That's all, so we're all moving into union, but in that union, this is how Teilhard would put it, in that union with Christ, we are also differentiated. I like to think about Winnicott, right? And his definition of the good parent, or the good mother, or the good enough mother is how he put it. He says, parents, what they really need to be able to do is to create an environment that the child can be alone in the presence of another. The child can be alone in the presence of another, meaning the child is not constantly looking over their shoulder, wondering if they're doing the right thing, wondering if they're being judged, wondering if, if their parents are even there. You wonder if they're going to get smacked. The child, and I think that's a great definition of love. Like, can you allow another person to be themselves in your presence as if they were alone? Not lonely. I don't mean isolated. I mean as if they were able to do what they would do if they were alone. So anyway, that's just a metaphor for me to think about this love as a union, but also differentiating, allowing one to have this uniqueness. So this is Maximus through my eyes. Okay. Oh, I just want to point that this is all about the many become one and the one become many, just like I just sort of said, but in a different way. This movement toward God will end in the state of joy, he says. Pleasure, joy, and rapture, he says. Pleasure, joy, and rapture. He didn't mean like rapture, like, like this car will, in the state of rapture, will be unmanned or something. He meant ecstasy in a sense, And this is kind of cool, and Teilhard will say this in a different way. Christ, when Christ was born, came into creation to show us a new way of being human. So let that sink in for a second, like a new way of being human. Remember back to the beginning slide where he was like, we look for love in all the wrong places, that our passions and our, in his case, he would say our flesh kind of pulls us in this direction that's away from what is really good, real for us, It kind of the idea of false self and true self almost, maybe is how we would put it. And so Christ comes in to show us there is an authentic way to be human.
To be more Christ-like or more unique-like?
Both. Because your uniqueness is Christness. That's how that's how Teilhard would definitely put it, and probably him too. This is Maximus, and if you could really look at all those little pictures, that's all the miracles he did.
So going back to what Larry said, being able to identify the difference between false self and real self, or your authentic self, is that?
I think that's the process, right? That's the process of sanctification and deification, right? I think this is sort of a neat way of thinking about what our end is, like the omega point, as Teilhard would say, like what life is in some ways about, like finding this. But I think that but there are dead ends in evolution. There are dead ends in our own lives. There are like times when we make mistakes. Like they would never say that they're like sin is gone and now you're on this straight path to Christification. So you're gonna learn that in life, But the first step is to recognize that there is such a thing, And where do you go to figure it out? I mean, honestly, they would talk about the church, the community of God as being, but remember that's a weird thing for us because like Marilyn said, there are churches that people have gone to that do not seem like they're deifying us very, very well, or definitely not bringing us to our unique Marylandness, they seem like they're pushing us away. So you can't identify with their sort of theory with the practical all the time. But the community helps. The way I think of it is this. I was talking to Adam, I think we were talking about this. Sometimes an idea comes into your head, you research it. That idea brings you to some book. That book brings you to another author. And then you find out that so-and-so is also reading that author. And then you talk to them. All that forms you, and then you get sick, and something bad, and you end up in the hospital, and that too forms you, and you get these experiences. How do you deal with those? Then those become challenges that sort of form your very being, and hopefully you do it in a good way and not a bad way. Now, how do you discern that? I mean, I think that's sometimes we can figure it out, and sometimes we end up on a path, and it's only later that we go, shoot, how did I end up here,
Did they think that you could reach the omega in life, or
No.
not until death?
No, and Teilhard would say the omega is kind of a projection, like there's no way to kind of prove that it's there, and if we get to it, he talks of it more as a projection of what he sees evolution up to this point as being, so then he says, I'm kind of hypothesizing this kind of thing. But he says it also kind of fits with the idea of Christ being all in all. But that's the Colossians idea that God becomes all in all. So this sort of our eschatological hope, that we're moving towards it. It's like the future, that future influences are present, but it's not, we don't necessarily arrive in our lifetime or perhaps even in the history of the world. Marilyn?
Yeah, I think there's growth, and anytime you have something severe happen, or just you get sick, or there's something wrong in your life, it's a good thing, or in the.
Right. So in some way, and this is the hardest thing, and I didn't actually put a slide in here about this because I was like, this is going to probably come up all through this, but how do we understand suffering, right? How do we understand evil? How do we understand in this process that seems so wonderful and it's going to end up in pleasure and rapture? And just to reinforce what you said, so everybody could kind of hear it. You know, Paul in Romans will say all things work together for the good of those who love God. You know, and this idea that when we look back on an event that's suffering, we see something in it that changed us, and maybe even there was some good in it. And I think a lot of us do that. Now, I think there's a little bit of, I have a hard time with like saying that's what I believe completely all the time, and that's because I have been in the midst of suffering with people, and I've had my own suffering, and it's like, I would never want to say to somebody, like in a couple weeks, you're going to look back on this and be like, this cancer was the best thing that ever happened to me. You know, like, it's like, oh my gosh, if somebody said that, you'd be like, oh, that's not very compassionate.
God is in, He's with you in this stuff.
Right.
Never
That's right.
For instance, real quick this morning, we were without water.
Yeah.
There's no water in the house. And you don't appreciate it until it's there's.
Yeah, right. Good, Marilyn. That's a good way of thinking about how do these sort of setbacks kind of like perhaps form us a little bit. Maybe they make us more grateful for the times. And I know that can sound a little bit blah, 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 but I think it's real. I do think it's real that, like, you know, I've been practicing medicine for 15 years, and there's been times when I've been like, this is like the worst job in the world. And I have tried to, like, over time, learn how to deal with my own suffering in the midst of the suffering of others. And I think it's made me a better doctor that I didn't quit 3 years in because it was too hard. Like, it formed me, even though that wasn't fun. Like, I would sometimes go and cry before I went into the clinic because it was overwhelming. You know, but now I look back and think, I'm kind of glad I didn't see that as a sign to quit. You know, back to maybe Larry's idea of discernment. Like, it's a hard question. You don't know always what the sign is for going, that this is actually a bad path, not a good path. I don't know. Sometimes I think it's just some voice in you or something that says, nah, don't quit yet. Even though no voice said that in my head, I just didn't quit. You know, that kind of thing. So, anyway, let's move on from there. Can we move on? Okay. Because we got a lot to do. This is just, I actually lifted this from last week a little bit, just to kind of remember for us to kind of think back. You know, the ancients had this really idea that anything that was becoming was a little bit imperfect, and that imperfection, remember they had, again, back to that idea, they had this idea that the matter was kind of dragging us down and the spirit was dragging us up. They saw them not as two sides of the same coin, but as two antagonistic forces. And we're trying to kind of maybe not see it that way, because God became human, not because God hated the world, right? Because God so loved the world. To me, I don't know how you'd read that as God hates matter, but, you know, it happened. And I just sum up these ideas of incarnate in Christ's body in the community, and also remember Matthew 25, incarnate in the least of these. You know, these are ways that God speaks to us. Okay? So I didn't say that before, but I do think that one of the ways to discern ego versus God is to think about service. Like, how does this serve others? Does it serve others, you know? Also, and remember about this whole temporal dimension, you know, like God, like this whole idea of eternity and time, you know, like God is like forever and forever and forever, but eternity is not like one moment after another into infinity. It's outside of time. And then when you get into time, there's like this, like all of a sudden God, like it's this idea of an unfolding. And this is I think this is hard to get our minds around, and I don't expect you necessarily to, because I'm not even sure I'm going to be able to explain it well. Like, let me think if I can think of an example. So, when you look at an Advent calendar, I'm talking about one of the little ones where you open the windows, right? And you look at it, and all the windows are
With
closed.
candy or not without candy?
This one is a Star Wars Lego one that Marge got me this year, where I get to like come on.
Ellie has one with Lego.
Yeah, and you put them together. We're gonna do this one. And you look, it's all there. Every bit of the Advent calendar is there. All the little figures, all the little instructions, it's all there. But the only way the Advent calendar works is if you open one box at a time. Okay? Not a perfect metaphor, but this idea, God is all. But God is not God without being in time. You know?
I mean, we have to be in time.
That's right. That's why we'll talk about, Teilhard, about this cosmogenesis, this like, you know, we're in the process of becoming toward this omega point. So, okay, we're gonna skip over some of these slides so we can get to Teilhard, I think, a little bit. But this, I do want to read this. I want us to sort of think about the creation as an ongoing, you know, like as to sort of see this sort of process, you know, that we see in this. So this is from a translation. I'll read it. At the beginning of God's creating of the heavens and the earth, when the earth was confusion and chaos, darkness over the face of ocean, rushing spirit of God sweeping over the face of waters, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light that it was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was setting and there was dawning, day one. And you remember each day, you know, this sort of emergence of the different creatures and you know, from the earth. And this sort of beginning where God is sort of hovering over, and all of a sudden begin, like, I always, and I've said this to others before, but I like to picture this almost as like a drama, you know, like there's God and there's the earth, those are the two characters, or God and these waters, those are the two characters, and it's dark, and all of a sudden, boom, the lights go on, you know, and then remember the next thing is God separates, and it's like God, it really the way the motion is like he throws up a canopy to separate waters above from waters below, and then says, "Let the earth emerge," or "Let the earth be, you know, come forth," and the waters drain away so that the earth comes there, and then let the earth sprout forth, you know, green things and seeding things, and then let humankind appear, you know. So what I want us to kind of just sort of immerse ourselves in a little bit for a second is just in this creation story, this intimate connection between God and the earth, you know, God and creation. That it's like we tend to sort of think of God as outside and kind of like, you know, then the earth is over there. But the creation story is very much about God kind of being very close to, at least I think so, in the images, God being close to and intimate with the earth. This is the cosmic Christ. And remember, you know, the ending of it, right? God saw all of this and indeed it was very good. Each valued in a sense for its very being, right? Like, so it's kind of odd again, like how these guys really, and that was what Augustine did struggle with. He was like, you know, but being is good. You know, being is a good. And so I can't be completely anti-matter because it's part of creation. So there was this whole idea, remember, how our wills are where the evil gets put in. Like we tend to use things wrongly. You know, we tend to use matter in a bad way. Or, you know, as later thinkers will think, like we tend to not steward but destroy, that kind of thing. So anyway, let's move on from this. This is just a little way to kind of get us out of thinking about this. And I think it's time to move on to Teilhard. So remember this quote from last week. "For me, my God, all joy and all achievement, the very purpose of my being and all my love of life all depend on this one basic vision of union between yourself and the universe. I have no desire, I have no ability to proclaim anything except the innumerable prolongations of your incarnate being in the world of matter. I can preach only the mystery of your flesh, you the soul shining forth through all that surrounds us. That's him. So let's talk a little bit about his life. So he was born in a region called Auvergne in central France. He entered so he was born in 1881. Okay, so his lifespan spans the turn of the century into World War I and World War II. He entered the Jesuits and learned philosophy and explored the countryside. So this is like, so his beginning years, he basically, the way the Jesuits work is you go in and you learn philosophy first, then you teach. So he went to Cairo and taught physics, actually. And then you go back and you learn theology. And so and the reason he had to learn in England was because France at the time was outlawing religious orders. So he went, they weren't killed or something, but they just couldn't, they couldn't have their own institutions and stuff. So he goes to this island of Jersey, and then he goes to South England, Sussex, where he learns his theology. During that time, though, he had this sort of love of the natural world. His father would take him out into the countryside in France and teach him about natural history, and he really loved rock and stuff, and we'll get into that in a second. I'm going to just go through his life here. So he was ordained a priest, but then he studied paleontology. Then he was drafted into World War I and became a stretcher bearer. During that time, he actually is doing some writing, and some of his early ideas are even during the suffering of World War I. He becomes a paleontology professor in the next decade prior to World War II, etc. And then he finishes one of his famous books called The Divine Milieu, which is here. This is Divine Milieu. And then he goes back to China, where he makes the famous discovery with others of Peking Man. You guys have ever heard of that discovery? It was. So I'll just briefly. I mean, does anybody know it? So Peking Man was it was like. I don't really know it all, but I'll just tell you what part of it was just an early human ancestor. Okay, it was an early human form, and what was startling about it is I think at the time there was one discovered in Africa, but then this one was discovered there, and the question about human origins came up. So it was a really famous discovery. He was part of a team, and I want to get into this a little bit later, but I want to not think of Teilhard just as this wonderful figure. He spent all that time in China. He never learned the Chinese language. He didn't really know the culture very well. He was a little bit of a French chauvinist. And you might even go, so there are a couple of things in his writings that go so far as to, I think he was probably racist. I don't think he was a Nazi or something like that, but he was thought of I don't think he thought the Chinese were, I think he thought there was racial differences between the Chinese and the Europeans. Now, I still think there are things to learn from him. I don't think he needs to be jettisoned, but I just want us to be aware of that. He's not perfect. He did not reach his omega point.
Was he a stretcher bearer because he was a conscious objector? Is that why?
No, I think maybe because he was a priest.
Yeah.
That may have been right. I don't know. It's a good question. I should say I don't know. I don't think he chose that, but he, yeah. So the next work that he.
Wait.
Yes.
Peking Man / what's that next word?
Synanthropus. That's the scientific name.
Okay.
I think it's Homo synanthropus, maybe. I don't know for sure, but that's that one. And by the way, he's in China for World War II. Not doing much. I mean, doing paleontology. And then he writes this other thing called the human phenomena, and we will talk about this one in a little bit. This is where his main ideas of evolution come up. These were the only two works that were complete books. The rest of them, a lot of them are essays. This one was never published in his lifetime because the Catholic Church said no. And he was obedient to the Catholic Church for that. He ends up, because of a lot of controversy, ends up in New York City because of the controversy around his ideas during that time. This is the 50s. This is before Vatican II. And he dies in New York City on Easter Sunday. So I told you about his early years in just exploring the countryside. So remember, this is 19th century. These are 19th century iron nails. He loved iron as a little boy. You know why he loved iron? Because he thought it was permanent. He thought it could never die. He thought, this is it. And he traces some of his first spiritual ideas to this idea of this permanence of iron. And then, what does he discover? Iron rust. And he says it's devastating to him when he finds this out, that there's a corruptibility there. And he's like, wait a minute, I thought this was my permanent thing. But he doesn't give up on this idea that matter might have a little permanence to it. And so what does he transfer that to? Sorry, where am I? Well, so he goes, let me just tell you about this. I heard about that. Yeah, it's quartz and chalcedony. Or how do you say that? Does anybody know? That's another gem. Chalcedony or chalcedony. It's actually referenced in the Bible in a couple places. But he thought this rock was kind of like his new idea of solidity, of what is really beneath this flux of stuff and becoming. And he writes this, he said, I would never feel at home except in an ocean of matter. And I'll give you a picture of the countryside where he is. That's quartz. And that's chalcedony or whatever. It's found in France, but it's found also in Morocco and other places. It's like a geode, it looks like, a little bit. That is the region where he grew up. Pretty cool, huh? Of course, that view is probably not the view from his window, but, Those are volcanoes. Those are green, and they're active. Did you know that? Did you know France had active volcanoes? I didn't. So, during his time in England, remember, he's studying theology and philosophy, but he's also studying some other things. He discovers the theory of evolution. He reads this book by Henry Bergson called Creative Evolution. He says, I don't really remember much about the book, but it definitely turned me on to this idea of evolution. And he begins to realize during that time that this search for solidity, this search for the permanent, this search for something that he calls it consistency actually, but what he means by consistency is not I'm showing up for you all the time. He means when the yogurt is liquid, consistency of yogurt is whatever, and the consistency of Coke is this, and the consistency of rock is this. That's what he meant by consistency. He wanted something firm, and he says, maybe it's not found in things, but in the direction in which things are going. Okay? It's kind of funny. If you ever read St. Augustine says something very similar. He said, I realized that the term substance and the term matter may not have to be the same thing. In other words, that our minds and what is produced by our minds and what is produced by the Spirit is also a substance, even though it's not a material substance. So he's like, maybe it's not what I'm searching for, what is really going to give me. And he struggles to say, because I keep using the term solidity, and I think that's important, but he also says it's just this sense of being grounded, this sense of being himself. He said, maybe it's in the fact that things are going somewhere. And so he's not quite there yet. He's not quite there into understanding what he thinks the goal of evolution is, but the seeds are being planted at this time. And he realizes that creation is not a fixed and static thing, but one's on the move. And again, creation's not done. That's the thing. Creation's not done. That's the countryside in Sussex, where he said that a lot of these ideas came to him. He talks about sunset in Sussex, so this is sunset in Sussex. I told you about being a stretcher bearer in World War I, and I'm sorry, I don't know why he did that, but I think it might be religious. And so remember this book, it's called The Divine Milieu. You know what the term milieu means? Milieu is a kind of environment. So Good Shepherd has a milieu. You come in and it feels a certain way, and people treat you a certain way, and you might not get immersed completely in that milieu until you've been there for a while, but it's got a character to it. You come to Good Shepherd and you go to Ascension, they're different. You don't go and go, gee, I thought I was in Good Shepherd when you walk into Ascension. Geez, it's weird. You don't. You know, there's a milieu, right? Well, he began to have this idea of milieu when he was in World War I. And he realized that people aren't individual, atomized people doing their own thing without any connection to each other. But they actually influence each other. Their very like thoughts and stuff and actions are influenced by what other people are doing and what is happening to them. Not just what they're doing, but what is happening to them. And so, he thinks about all these because he thought like the uniqueness of human beings was hard for him to reconcile with the idea of universal goodness. But if everybody's like unique, like how could there be like something common to them? And it's part of the problem with anybody who's really into matter, right? Like matter is a unique thing. Like every piece of matter is unique. So how do you take this uniqueness and put it together with universalness? Just like Heidi, your question, am I becoming more me or am I becoming more like Christ? And your question, like, how do I know this is my ego or how do I know this is from God? Like, in other words, is there a different? Like, what about my uniqueness is in God? And so he began to say, but we're not atoms, though. We're molecules. And we're not just molecules, we're conglomerations. We're not just conglomerations, we're communities. So this idea of the noosphere, and we'll get to that. There's a picture. He is not in that picture, but that's World War I's trench. That's him. So, this is kind of, I thought this was really, when I was reading about it, this is the point where I was like, oh, I see why he called it the human phenomenon. So he writes this book called, it's translated as The Phenomenon of Man, but it really could be, it's better translated as the human phenomenon. And what he says in there is, listen, I am trying to write a scientific treatise. I'm not trying to write a philosophy text, even though it's more philosophy than science. But what he says is, look at the history of the world. Remember, he's a paleontologist. Look, he knows about the early history of the earth, about the magma at its core, about the crust, about all the layers of rock. And he says, isn't it interesting that all that prepared the way for life? And isn't it interesting that life gave birth to humans? And isn't it interesting, this is what it'll eventually say, that humans gave birth to Christ? He's like, isn't that, and I know that's a Christian perspective, if you want to stop at humans, you can. He says, doesn't that speak to a direction? That's what he thought. I'm trying to convince you of what he's thinking. You might say, no. If we look back, when all humans are gone, if somebody could look back and say, that was a horrible experiment, in evolutionary terms. But he didn't think that way. He thought that the human being was important, wasn't just a mistake, but there was something that unconsciousness is becoming consciousness. That's what he saw. Remember, he's a rock dude. They don't talk to you. They don't even yield to you. They just are there. And so all of a sudden he's like, how did rock give birth to thought? So that's how he...
So, Rick, is he saying, I'm trying to understand,
Yeah.
Is he saying that, humans would evolve into, when we're gone, into, a spiritual...
That's an interesting question.
Consciousness without the body? I mean, not that we would destroy ourselves,
Yeah.
but that we would evolve
Yeah.
into something where we don't need a body.
Right. He wouldn't, I don't know that he would speculate about that, except for to say that, remember, he thinks, and we're probably not going to get there, but he really thinks that the body that's how we get the spirit. Remember, your sensations are important. Music comes into your ears and becomes transformed in you. So I don't know that he would say that we don't But a lot of people who use him, like think about the no, because he talks about this thing called the noosphere, which we'll try to get to, but like as this sort of just this layer of thought, like maybe we could all just be downloaded onto a computer.
So maybe there's something past you.
Well, he does talk about this thing called an ultra-human.
Okay.
But he doesn't mean ultra in like some sort of Superman Nazi sense or something. He means more like closer to Christ, is what he thinks. But it's a little odd. I don't know if I could go that far with him, to be honest. And I don't even know that you well, I'm not going to get in there. Okay, never mind. This is just layers. I wanted to show you layers. So magma, inner core. And you can go all the way out to the atmosphere. This is Chardin's idea. So you got the geosphere, called it the geosphere. Then you got the biosphere. Then you got the atmosphere. And then finally you get the noosphere. Okay? That's what he called it. Noos is mind in Greek. So this is the sphere of mind. So what he was saying was that when he was thinking about those World War I dudes, right? Like the milieu was thought on some level. Like how do we talk to each other? Like there is a noosphere happening right now, according to that. It's me talking to you processing it and asking me questions or being confused or raising your hand or whatever. Go ahead.
Does that mean that this big picture here with all the pictures in it,
Yeah.
is that our idea, is that his idea? Did he make that little picture?
This one?
No, that one.
Did he make this? Did he draw this?
Uh-huh.
No, this is somebody interpreting him, you know. Like, so some people have thought about the internet as the noosphere, right? Like it's this sort of electrical cyber thing. And he would have said it's part of it, but he wouldn't have said that's all of it, you know. And he thought that the noosphere was bringing us closer and closer together, that we were actually being kind of connected more and more and more and more. Not separated, but connected. But remember, for him, to be connected is also to be, the more you unite, the more you differentiate. True union respects the person. It's not totalitarianism. It's not like everybody needs to be part of a machine. Yes, we all contribute to the ongoing work of the Incarnation, he would say. We all contribute to the ongoing work of the Incarnation, but we do so uniquely. We're not cogs. And then he says, look, I want you to be amazed at all this. And he says, the human gives birth not just to thought, this is the big jump, not just to thought, but to affectivity, meaning emotion, meaning love. And not just because there is like sexual love in the biosphere, but for us, love goes beyond the procreative. And he would say, and this is, okay, so this is not for like young ears, but he would say, like the Catholic Church, remember, thought that the main purpose of sexual activity was procreation. He did not. He kind of hinted that he didn't believe that. That he thought that sexual energy among humans in the married relationship, it was an expression of this new kind of love. But he considers it a Christic love, okay? To love again, where like my use of Winnicott, in this out of context a little bit, but this love in which the other can be alone in your presence, Okay, I already talked about that.
So you're saying that Christ-like love, though, like that's the next level,
Right.
like above all of
Yeah,
that.
right. Exactly. And Teilhard had a hopeful take on this process, right? I mean, you can't be like, if you want to criticize him, you could say, geez, humankind definitely does not feel like it's going in this direction. But he had a hopeful take. He did. And part of it, I think, was his faith. But part of it was just him. I mean, he didn't, honestly, I don't think he really had that bad of an experience in World War I. He didn't write about, he wrote about the suffering, don't get me wrong. He wasn't a Pollyannish, I don't mean it that way. He was a real person, and he talked about the death of his friends and whatnot. It didn't devastate him. He still saw the good in humanity. Even after he found out about the death camps in World War II. You know, he still thought that humanity was moving in this direction. So that was him, you know. See, there's that, see, Christogenesis. Sacred Heart, he says, was really important to him. I think I'm going to kind of I think we're pretty much done. So let me just, let me read to you one last quote of his. Read a couple of these. These are, so he writes about this mystic vision he has. Remember I talked about that idea of him, I always thought of myself, I only felt at home when I was in the midst of an ocean of matter. So this is some of his mystical writings. This is matter talk. This is God in matter sort of talking to this person who's in this kind of state in which, kind of like Ezekiel was in Elijah and Elisha with the chariot and the flame. Remember that? But it doesn't matter if you don't remember. It's just there was this mystical vision, and he writes about this, and he says this is God talking to this dude. He's like, you must have oil for your limbs. Like, how do you say that you can live without me, meaning matter? How can you say you can live without matter? You must have oil for your limbs, blood for your veins, water for your soul, the world of reality for your intellect. Remember, this is, again, going back to that. You must see it, touch it, live in its presence, and drink the vital heat of existence in the very heart of reality. Never say matter is accursed or evil. Remember, there was one who said, take, eat, this is my body. So I was thinking about that today when I was doing that. You know, like, Lord, we give to you this gift from your creation. We are in the Eucharist symbolically doing what we're supposed to be doing in our lives, which is making the creation more Christ-like. That's his vision. That our work in the world is actually, he'll say this, completing God, filling God. Now, we only have 2 minutes, so we can't go into the argument about whether God's complete or not complete or all that. But, you know. Son of man, he says, bathe yourself in the ocean of matter, where you were cradled in your pre-existence, and you will be raised up to God again by it. Let me see if I have one last quote. Let me just see if I want to leave you with one last thing. Okay, we'll do this. We imagine that creation was finished long ago, but that would be quite wrong. It still continues more magnificently, and we serve to complete it, even by the humblest work of our hands. That is ultimately the meaning and value of our acts. Owing to the interrelation between matter, not soul, but soul and Christ, we bring part of the being which he desires back to God in whatever we do. We bring part of being back to God in whatever we do. With each one of our works, we labor in individual separation, but no less really to build the pleroma. That means the fullness of the universe. That is to say, we bring to Christ, each of us brings to Christ a little more fulfillment. And we'll end there. All right. Thank you, everybody. You're welcome.